He could have taken a direct flight from Dublin to Galileo Galilei Airport in Pisa. Instead, he chose a Dutch airline with connecting flights first to Paris and then on to Florence. Examining his boarding pass, he double-checked the date and times on the overhead monitor. 10th of the 3rd, 2011, departure 0620. If all went according to plan, he had plenty of time to catch the connecting flight to Florence at 11:05. He cared little about losing a few more hours. It meant nothing. The only important thing was his intention and the knowledge that his trip, well overdue, was finally coming to pass. Once safely on the plane, he smiled affectionately at the stewardesses, sitting back with ease, enjoying the sound of English, French and Dutch instructions coming from the cockpit, just like he had as a boy, when his curiosity about language had first been aroused. He was now 3 months into his leave of absence from Newell Design, and he missed developing architectural plans and elevations. Still, looking after his deranged mother had had some advantages. For one thing, it meant he didn't have to listen to the continuous whining of the imbeciles with whom he worked. He prided himself on being a good listener, for these days, far too many people spent far too long talking rather than thinking. Of course, the upside of being a good listener was that he found out most things he needed to know, in the end. Studying people was one of his pet pastimes, working out exactly what made them tick and why. He liked to categorise them, something that had been easy at Newell Design, given how transparent his colleagues had been. There was Jackie, who'd done numerous courses. Upskilling was what she called it, but he had another name for it. Jack of all trades, master of none. It was the mark of a woman who longed to be someone different, but who didn't have the imagination to achieve any real change. Then there was Snivelling Susan, who'd buried her husband last year and was looking to start over, which entailed a lot of blathering about inner peace and a new penchant for tarot cards. And young cool guy David, oh yes, the boss definitely liked him. The others didn't particularly interest him either. Carla from Scotland, Daniel with a face like a bulldog, and reliable Henry, who'd worked at the company for so long that everyone kept a keen eye on his desk in the hope that one day he might not be there. They were a tedious bunch. Only Jarlath offered any sense of intrigue. Jarlath shared his admiration for 17th century French philosophers and mathematicians, which meant talking to him was at least tolerable. In appearance, however, Jarlath disappointed. He was in his early 30s and scrawny, a man who would benefit from some building up and taking more care of himself. Despite being 20 years Jarlath's senior, he felt physically superior. He suspected Jarlath was an only child, just like he was. This was indicated by some of his more obvious qualities: self-obsession, a loner, happier burying his head in a book rather than watching television, a keen appreciation of music, good music, that is, not the rubbish variety that seemed to be played in every home, office and coffee shop. "Would you like some tea or coffee, sir?" The stewardess had such a lovely smile. "Any herbal tea, my dear?" "Of course," he said, and smiled again. Jarlath and he had often discussed Blaise Pascal, a pure intellectual in the truest sense, combining a love of mathematics and logical reasoning with an insatiable desire to understand mankind. When he told them he needed a leave of absence from work, Snivelling Susan had been the worst. Still lamenting her late husband when she'd found out he had an ailing mother, she'd stupidly thought he could share her pain. Jarlath had displayed heightened levels of discomfort at Susan's overkill of empathy. It was the kind of emotional display that never sat easily on the shoulders of the young. Choosing a window seat, he was relieved that both seats to his right remained empty, and he was free to enjoy the clear blue sky above the clouds, losing himself in thought. It was often difficult keeping up the facade of being nice, and he had no doubt that if any of his colleagues had been asked about him, their opinions would be completely flawed. This was of his own making, of course, as generally he made a point of presenting a two-dimensional aspect of himself to the world. Accordingly, he dished out his usual round of pleasantries before leaving, promising Jackie he'd consider her suggestion to examine all forms of upskilling while he was away. Oh, such a lovely man, he'd heard Susan say as he closed the office door behind him. He smiled grimly at the memory of being out of their company and able to breathe in fresh air. Yes, he had earned his break, and not only just from them, but from the old bag too. He knew tongues would wag in the village about him taking a trip to Tuscany while her ladyship was on her last legs. But a week's respite was what he needed. Let the local rumour mill churn out whatever it chose. It'd never be any more than speculation. Standing in the elegant foyer of the Hotel de Tucci, he stood back and admired the black and white checkered floor. Across this enormous chessboard, guests, hotel staff and overly pampered dogs and cats scuffled noisily. He'd not stay long in Florence. One night's rest was all that was required. Then he'd be ready to start the drive to Livorno. Choosing to take the stairs rather than the lift to his room on the first floor, he thought again about how his mother's unintentional trips down memory lane had awakened feelings he'd suppressed for far too long, and how it was with a mix of anticipation and trepidation that he planned the next leg of his journey. In many ways, his life was now echoing the works of Pascal. Let each one examine his thoughts. He'll find them all occupied with the past and the future. This empathy of thought pleased him. The drive to Livorno was a pleasant one, with russet-coloured rooftops dotting the landscape. The road eventually led into the lovely seaside town he remembered so well from his youth. The distance was short, a little over 20 kilometres, and he'd switched cars at Pisa, enjoying the covert aspect of it all. Much time had passed since that old business, so there was really no cause for any concern, but being careful added a certain excitement to the proceedings. With the car window rolled down, he took in the familiar smells of a place to which he'd always known he would return. Mother hadn't meant to resurrect the old wounds, but years of her keeping a trap shut had been overdone by the garbled workings of a decaying brain, and once resurrected, it had changed everything. It started harmlessly enough, but then it usually did. "Do I look different today?" she purred, deluding herself that her beauty had returned. "No, not particularly." The air in her bedroom had been dry, stifling. "But you're looking at me, staring the way you like to. You always liked looking at your mother, didn't you?" "I was just looking, nothing more." "You shouldn't stare at me that way. People might talk." He'd turned his back on her, but the idiotic bitch had continued. "But who cares about them? We don't, my darling, do we? We never did. None of them understand. Jealousy is a dreadful affliction, don't you think?" "No one is jealous. You are rambling." "Don't lie, little boy. I can see right through you." Standing at her sick bed, he had breathed in the stench of her old age. "I'm not a little boy anymore." "You're staring again." "Am I?" "You know you are, and don't lean on my shoulders so hard. It hurts. You think I'm weak-minded, don't you? But I have the measure of you." "Just checking your reflexes, Mother. They're as sharp as ever, I see." "You were the same with that young tramp, staring at her too, following her like some demented lapdog." "Why don't you take your pills, Mother? You know how you like to lose yourself." "She was a tramp, you know. Antonio liked tramps, young ones especially. Don't you remember? Don't you? Oh, but you must." He'd felt his spine tighten as he clenched his fists. He'd remembered Tuscany and the room with the long windows. "Shut up." Tickle, tickle, tickle. Her claw-like fingers had reached out, touching his chest. "Remember how you liked this, little boy?" "I never liked it." He'd stood back farther, because the desire to punch her had suddenly become so strong, throbbing through him like a sharp pain. It would be a mercy, some might think, to finish off the old bitch. He'd taken a long, measured breath, letting her ramble as he'd listened. In the end, he was glad he had. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to remember any of it. Arriving at the outskirts of Livorno, he felt relief at being far away from her. He could almost taste the treasures that Savoretto would unfold. His intentions and aspirations had been clear from the beginning. The trip was simply a way of rekindling the more positive aspects of the past. Sometimes, though, life sends you an added bonus and the course changes, taking you somewhere unexpected. As he walked across the paving stones in Savoretto's ancient town centre, its narrow alleyways and broad squares captivating him, he saw Bishop Antonio Peri. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks, that it was just a stooped, overweight old man who resembled Antonio. When he looked again, it was undeniably him. Even without the pomp and glamour of his ornate bishop's robes. The last he'd heard, the poisonous bishop had relocated to Florence, but it seemed he too had been compelled to return. And there he was, drifting easily with the locals, none of them knowing the kind of monster that he was. It took some time to secure a private audience with him. In the end, just like the old bitch, the once arrogant pig shared far more than he'd intended. Words crawling through old wounds, the fall from the cliff edge some days later would have been attributed to his fragility and stupidity. What was a frail old man thinking, walking on such a dangerous cliff edge? The sea had been so blue, the sun blinding on the water. The fat bastard whining like an abandoned baby, tasting fear, begging for clemency with his pathetic babbling. He'd smiled to himself as he heard the bishop's scream curling through the air, his death resonating a new beginning.